Welcome to Whispers of Asia, where stories are not just told, but whispered into the night and etched into your mind. Here, we guide you through shadowed alleys, riverbanks, rice fields, and forgotten villages, where the line between the living and the dead is as thin as morning mist. Every tale is a door, and once you step through, you'll carry its shadow forever. Tonight, we take you to a remote Bangladeshi village where the monsoon rains swell the river until it swallows the rice fields and drowns the land in secrets buried for decades. The villagers say that if you look into the floodwater at night, you might see a face staring back, not your reflection, but that of Jolchhobi, the water portrait, the spirit of a drowned woman whose body was never found. Those who see her face are cursed. Water will seep into their home no matter the weather, rising higher each night, and in its dark surface her face will grow clearer until it smiles with their own mouth. When the rains come, never meet your own eyes in the water, because they may no longer be yours. The day the first rain came, the air in the village felt strange. It wasn't just the heat, though it had been clinging for weeks, making the skin slick and heavy. It wasn't just the stillness, though the birds had fallen silent 2 days before, their songs cut short as if some unspoken warning had passed among them. It was something harder to name, the feeling that the ground itself was waiting, holding a breath it could no longer keep. Rafiq had woken early that morning, but the sky had already been clouded over. The light was dim and gray, casting no real shadows. By midday, the horizon had turned the color of wet charcoal, the clouds so low they seemed to press on the tops of the palm trees. Somewhere far off, he heard the first distant rumble. When the rain came, it came all at once. Fat drops burst against the tin roof of their stilted house, hitting in irregular bursts that became, within minutes, a steady, unbroken roar. The smell of wet soil rose immediately, rich and metallic, mixed with the faint rot of fallen mangoes fermenting in the mud. Rafiq stood barefoot at the edge of the narrow path that wound between his family's rice paddies. Beneath his toes, the dry dirt was already softening, drinking in the water like a long, thirsty throat. He could feel the coolness rising from it, seeping into the soles of his feet. Beyond the paddies, the Padma River stirred. Its surface was no longer smooth. Each raindrop shattered the water into countless tiny explosions, rippling outward until the ripples met and merged into a restless dance. The river's color darkened as if the depths had risen closer to the surface. From the veranda, his grandmother, Amina, watched him. She sat on a low reed mat, her knees drawn up, a dented metal bowl in her lap. Her thin fingers moved with steady rhythm, shelling green peas. Thip, thip, thip. The sound barely audible over the rain. Her hair, once black, had faded to a soft silver, and the lines in her face were as deep as the river channels in dry season. She didn't look up when she spoke. "The river's awake." Her voice was low, almost lost in the hiss of rain, but Rafiq heard it clearly. He turned his head toward her. "It's just the monsoon starting." Amina shook her head once, her eyes fixed on her hands. "The river sleeps through heat and wind, but when it wakes, keep your eyes away from the water at night. Don't test your reflection." Rafiq had heard this before. Every year, the same warning when the rains came. But something in her tone made the skin on his neck prickle. A weight, as though the words were not a habit, but an urgent reminder. He let the rain soak his shoulders and hair, watching as the paddies filled. Far off, the line between land and river blurred until it was gone. The Padma could swell quickly. He'd seen it take a whole field in one night. Another rumble of thunder rolled over the sky, deep and long. A gust of wind rattled the bamboo wind chime under the eaves, the hollow notes uneven and strange. For a moment, the rain thinned just enough that he could see the far bank. Mist clung low over the water, stubborn against the wind. Then lightning split the sky, a sudden vein of white that lit the river like a sheet of molten silver. In that brief flash, Rafiq saw something, a pale oval shape just beneath the surface, unmoving, watching. Then darkness swallowed it. He blinked hard, wiped the rain from his face, and told himself it was driftwood or a trick of the light. Still, his feet felt rooted to the spot. The rain drummed louder. Beneath it, treading between the thunder and the wind, came a sound so soft he might have missed it. A slow, deliberate inhale. Not the rush of a swimmer surfacing, not the rush of the current. Breathing. And it was coming from the water. Rafiq's pulse quickened. He turned toward the veranda, but Amina was no longer watching him. She was staring past him, toward the river, her hands stilling in the bowl of peas. He followed her gaze. The surface of the Padma was empty, just rain and ripples. But his skin stayed cold all the way back to the house. When he stepped inside, water clung to his ankles. He glanced down. The wooden floor was wet, though the rain hadn't blown in. A small puddle had formed near the doorway, dark and still, its surface reflecting the faint glow of the cooking fire. And in that reflection, for the briefest heartbeat, he thought he saw a smile. The rain did not ease when morning came. It poured through the night in a single, endless curtain, turning every path into a thread of brown water, and every hollow in the ground into a pool. The world outside the stilted houses seemed blurred, as if the rain itself was smudging the edges of reality. Inside, the air was thick with the mingled scents of wet wood, smoke from the cooking fire, and the faint sourness of damp cloth. Rafiq sat cross-legged near the fire pit, holding a piece of warm flatbread in his hands. He tore it absent-mindedly, chewing without tasting. The image from last night, that pale oval beneath the lightning, kept resurfacing, like something bobbing just under the mind's surface. Amina moved slowly around the small space, setting a pot of tea over the flames. Her joints clicked faintly when she crouched, the sound oddly loud in the muffled world of rain. She had been quiet all morning, but now, as the steam began to rise, she spoke without looking at him. "It happened before you were born," she said, her voice flat and steady. "The year the flood took more than the crops." Rafiq glanced up from the bread in his hands. His grandmother rarely told stories unprompted. When she did, they were never casual things. They were warnings, stitched into memory. She was called Sharifa, beautiful, stubborn. She had a laugh like bells, but a temper that could cut the air in a room. They promised her to a man she despised. He was rich, older, cruel in quiet ways. The night before the wedding, she vanished. The rain hissed louder against the roof, as if leaning closer to listen. They searched the river for 3 days. Men with bamboo poles walked the banks, dragging the water. Women combed the reeds for scraps of cloth. On the 3rd day, they found her scarf caught in the roots of the old fig tree, but not her body, never her body. Rafiq swallowed, the bread in his mouth suddenly dry. What do you think happened to her? His grandmother finally looked at him. Her eyes were clouded with age, but sharp in a way that made him feel suddenly young. What I think doesn't matter. It's what the river thinks that matters. He frowned. The river? When a soul drowns, but the body is never found, it cannot leave, Amina said, her voice lowered, as if afraid the words might carry beyond the walls. It lingers in the water, restless, and the longer it waits, the hungrier it becomes. But it can't cross into the world of the living without a vessel. It needs a body, a living one. She turned back to the fire, poured tea into 2 small enamel cups, and slid one toward him. They call her Jolchhobi, the water portrait. The face you see in the river at night is hers. If she chooses you, the water will find its way to you, in your yard, in your house, in your bed. Even if the sky is dry, the water will rise, and her face will become clearer. And when it smiles with your mouth, it means she's ready to take your place. The tea steamed between them. Rafiq didn't touch his cup. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the bamboo walls, and somewhere under the house, in the shadows between the stilts, came the faint sound of dripping. Rafiq's gaze drifted to the doorway. The puddle from last night was still there. He had expected it to soak into the wood or be swept away. Instead, it had grown. The surface was unnaturally still, not a single ripple despite the draft that stirred the room. He leaned forward slightly, the dim light catching in the water's skin. There, faint and distorted, but undeniably there, was the curve of a woman's smile. He jerked back, blinking hard. When he looked again, it was gone. "Daddy," he began, but stopped. Amina had seen it too. He could tell by the way her lips pressed tight, the way her hands trembled just slightly around her cup. She didn't say a word, but she reached for the small clay jar by the fire, took a pinch of black ash from inside, and flicked it into the puddle. The ash spread across the surface, breaking the reflection. Only then did she speak, her voice almost a whisper. "Don't ever answer if the water calls you by name." By the 3rd day of rain, the river had begun to spill its edges. The rice paddies behind Rafiq's house were half submerged, their young shoots swaying gently in the slow current that had crept in from the main channel. From a distance, it looked almost peaceful, green blades moving in unison under a gray sky, but to anyone who had lived through a flood, it was a dangerous beauty. That morning, Rafiq woke to the sound of water in places it should not be. It wasn't the hard drumming of rain on the roof or the rush of runoff past the stilts. It was a softer sound, the faint lap and slosh of movement in a small space. When he sat up, he saw it, a thin sheet of water covering the far corner of the room, reflecting the dim, flickering light from the cooking fire. It wasn't deep, just enough to cover the floorboards, but it hadn't been there when he went to sleep. Amina was already awake, sitting beside the fire with her shawl pulled tightly around her. She didn't look at the water. "Don't step in it," she said without turning her head. Rafiq swung his legs to the other side of his sleeping mat, keeping his bare feet well away from the thin, glistening film. "It must be a leak from the roof," he said. Her voice was firm. "The roof doesn't leak into corners." He didn't argue. Instead, he moved to the veranda and looked out. The rain had lessened to a steady drizzle, but the river was higher than he'd ever seen it this early in the season. The bank had disappeared in several places, and small streams of water were weaving their way between the houses like curious animals. He followed the largest of these streams with his eyes until it met the main body of the river. That was when he saw it. The surface near the center of the channel was unnaturally smooth, a circle of stillness in the middle of the restless current. The rain barely seemed to touch it. Each drop vanished into it without a ripple. He squinted. There was something pale beneath the surface, oval, motionless. A shiver ran up his spine. He stepped closer to the edge of the veranda, gripping the bamboo railing. The shape beneath the water tilted slightly, as if turning toward him. And then, impossibly, it rose just enough that the water's surface became a mirror. A face looked back at him. For a moment, he thought it was his own, but the proportions were wrong. The eyes were too large, too dark, the mouth too wide, the skin far too pale for any living person in the village. The lips were closed, but there was the suggestion of a smile that had been worn for too long. Rafiq's breath caught. The face moved closer, though the water around it did not stir. He could see the fine strands of hair floating around it now, black as river silt. Then the mouth opened. He didn't hear the sound with his ears so much as feel it in his chest, a slow, deliberate whisper carrying his name. Rafiq! He stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the veranda step. The face was gone. The water in the channel was just water again, rippling under the drizzle. Inside, Amina's eyes were on him. "You saw her," she said simply. It wasn't a question. Rafiq tried to speak, but his voice caught. It looked like... "Don't finish it," she snapped. "Don't give it shape in your words. The more you name it, the closer it comes." Outside, the rain began to fall harder again, and somewhere beneath it, he thought he heard that same slow inhale from the night of the first storm. This time, he knew it wasn't the river. The rain had turned the world into a gray, shifting maze. Every path between the stilted houses was now a narrow stream, the water cold and restless against bare ankles. Children splashed through it without fear, their laughter sharp against the steady hiss of rainfall. But the older villagers moved with caution. They knew water was not always just water. That afternoon, Amina told Rafiq they would visit the Otur Gor, the gathering house where the village elders met during the rains. She wrapped herself in her thickest shawl, its edges frayed but smelling faintly of dried neem leaves. "You'll hear from them what I've told you," she said, "and maybe then you'll listen." The walk was slow. The sky hung heavy, the clouds sagging low enough to snag on the tops of the betel nut trees. Every few steps, Rafiq felt the mud pull at his feet, reluctant to let go. The air was thick with the smell of wet bamboo and the faint tang of the river, a smell he was starting to notice even when the water wasn't visible. The Otur Gor sat at the highest point of the village, its walls of woven cane slick and dark from the rain. Inside, a fire burned low, its smoke curling toward the roof and slipping out through a hole in the thatch. Around the fire sat 5 figures, their shawls pulled tight, their faces carved by years of sun, wind, and watching the river change its course. They looked up as Amina entered, nodding in quiet recognition. One of them, an old man named Bashir, his beard the color of river foam, gestured for them to sit. "She's chosen him, hasn't she?" Bashir said, his eyes never leaving Rafiq's face. I don't know what I saw." "You saw her," another elder, a thin woman named Shahana, interrupted. "And once she's looked back at you, there's no pretending otherwise." The fire popped, sending a small shower of sparks into the air. The smell of the smoke was sharp, almost bitter. Bashir leaned forward, his knees cracking audibly. "Jolchhobi is not like other spirits. She doesn't wander or whisper to everyone. She waits, she watches, and when the river gives your name, the water will start to follow you. First in small ways, a puddle in your home, the smell of wet reeds where there are none, Then it will rise, a little higher each night, even if the skies are clear. Rafiq glanced at Amina, but she was watching the fire. Shahana spoke again, her voice low enough that Rafiq had to lean forward to hear. When the monsoon is at its peak, she will come to take you, and you will go quietly unless someone takes your place. The words hung in the air, heavier than the smoke. My place? Rafiq asked. Bashir's eyes softened, but only slightly. A body for a body. She cannot walk into the living world without leaving something behind in the river. If you do nothing, you will be that offering. Amina shifted, pulling her shawl tighter. Tell him the rest. The elders exchanged glances. Finally, Shahana spoke, her voice low enough that Rafiq had to lean forward to hear. There is a way to hold her off, not forever, but long enough to outlast the rains. On the night of the half moon, you must take an oil lamp to the water's edge and light it. You must call her name 3 times, but never look into the water. If she answers, you throw the lamp into the current. She will take its light instead of your breath, but only for 1 season. The next monsoon, she will come again. Rafiq tried to process the words, but all he could hear was the memory of that whisper in the water, calling his name. Bashir's voice cut through his thoughts. And if you fail, the river will not return you, not your body, not even your name. The fire crackled, the sound filling the silence that followed. Outside, the rain's steady rhythm felt sharper, as if it too was listening. When they left the Otur Gor, the light was already fading. The paths back to the house were narrower now, the water deeper. Once Rafiq thought he saw something moving against the current, a pale shape that slid past his legs and was gone before he could react. By the time they reached home, the puddle in the corner of the room had grown again. By the next morning, the rain had softened into a fine mist, but the world was no less wet. The river was now level with the tops of the bank trees, and small fish swam freely in the paths between the houses. The villagers moved more slowly than usual, stepping carefully along the makeshift bamboo walkways they had tied together overnight. Rafiq woke to the sound of dripping inside the house. It wasn't the random plink of water through a leaky roof. This was steady, deliberate, like the measured ticking of a clock. When he sat up, his heart sank. The puddle in the corner had spread. It was no longer just a shallow, dark patch. It had grown into a pool wide enough to reach the edge of his sleeping mat. The water was perfectly still, unnaturally clear, despite the mud everywhere else in the village. He could see the wood grain of the floorboards beneath it, sharp and undistorted, as if the water were a pane of glass. Amina was already awake, sitting beside the cooking fire with her shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders. She didn't look at the water, didn't even acknowledge it, but her hands moved faster than usual as she prepared the morning meal. Rafiq swung his legs away from the pool and stood, careful to keep his feet dry. Dadi, the water! Don't talk about it, she said sharply. Don't give it your attention. But it's getting bigger. It's not rainwater. It's... Her eyes snapped to his, and the look in them silenced him. Once you name it, it will answer, and you don't want to hear that answer. He bit back his words and stepped out onto the veranda. The air was heavy with the scent of wet reeds and something else, faint, metallic, almost like blood. He scanned the river in the distance, half expecting to see that same circle of stillness, but the water there was restless, rippling under the wind. When he returned inside, Amina was standing at the edge of the puddle, sprinkling black ash into it. The ash spread over the surface, but instead of sinking, it seemed to drift outward, as if carried by a slow breath from beneath. And then Rafik saw it. For the briefest moment, just before the ash covered it completely, a reflection stared back at him. The same pale face from the river, the same two wide eyes. But this time the lips moved, and though no sound reached his ears, he knew what they were saying. His name. That night, the water rose higher. It came without rain. The sky was dry, the clouds breaking to reveal a faint sliver of moon. But inside the house, the pool spread across the floor, creeping toward the sleeping mats. When Rafik woke in the dark, the cold touch of it was already against his hand. He sat up with a start. The surface of the water caught the moonlight from the window, turning it into a mirror. The face was there again, closer, clearer, and smiling. The first body appeared 3 days after the puddle in Rafik's house began to rise. It was found in the water jar of Hussein the potter, a massive clay container that stood taller than a child and held enough drinking water for a week. His wife had gone to draw from it at dawn, only to see her husband's face staring up at her from inside, eyes open but glassy, lips pale and slack. The strange thing was, Hussein was known in the village as the strongest swimmer. He had been raised on the river, ferrying people and goods since he was 12. The jar was too small to drown in, yet he was there, floating like a leaf, his body cold and heavy when they pulled him out. No one spoke the word Jolchhobi aloud, but the fear spread like water through sand. 2 nights later, a boy named Samir was found lifeless in his family's fishing boat, which was tied securely to the dock. His head and shoulders were wet, his hair slicked flat, though the rest of him was dry. His mother swore she had heard him talking to someone outside just before dawn, but when she called his name, there was no answer, only the soft sound of water lapping against the boat. Rafik heard all of this from the murmurs in the market, but what unsettled him most was not the stories, it was the pattern. Each death came with water where it didn't belong. That night, he stayed awake long after Amina had gone to sleep, sitting cross-legged by the cooking fire. The moonlight crept through the gaps in the bamboo walls, painting thin silver lines across the floor. The puddle had returned, broader now, stretching halfway across the room. He tried not to look at it, tried to focus on the sound of the fire, on the faint rustle of wind in the palms outside. But then he heard it, the slow inhale, the almost imperceptible exhale, the sound that was not the river, not the wind. Against his will, his eyes drifted to the water's surface. The face was there, not submerged now, but seeming to press against the underside of the water, as though it were a sheet of glass between them. The eyes locked on his, unblinking. The lips moved, forming his name slowly, savoring each syllable. Ra-Feek. He lurched to his feet, heart pounding, and backed into the wall. His movement must have broken something. The surface of the puddle rippled once, and the face was gone. But he couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't really left, that it was still there, just waiting for him to get close again. By morning, another villager was dead. This time it was the old woman who sold betel leaves by the market. They found her in her own bed, soaked to the bone, her hair plastered to her cheeks. The floor beneath her was dry. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew. The water portrait was moving faster now, and Rafik had been marked first. By the time the third body was found, the village elders decided they could not wait. It was Bashir, the oldest of the 5 elders, who made the announcement at the Otur Gor. His voice was hoarse from age, but the authority in it left no room for questions. "It has been too long since we made the river offering," he said. "This is why she is hungry. We will feed her before she takes more." The murmurs in the room quieted. No one needed to ask who she was. The ritual was ancient, older than the mosque, older than the paved road that stopped at the edge of the village. Once a year, before the monsoon reached its peak, the villagers would gather at the water's edge with flowers, rice, and pond leaves folded into small packets. These offerings were meant to calm the spirits of the river and, most importantly, to remind them that the living knew their place. But in recent years, the younger families had stopped attending. The floods came and went regardless, and the stories about the water portrait had begun to fade. Now, with 3 deaths in as many days, no one dared skip it. That afternoon, the preparations began. Women wove marigolds into long garlands, their orange and yellow petals almost glowing against the dull gray of the sky. Men carried baskets of cooked rice to the shore, the steam mingling with the smell of wet earth. Children were kept inside. Their parents said it was because of the rain, but everyone knew the real reason. Children were the easiest for her to take. Amina made Rafiq carry the largest of their offerings, a clay bowl filled with fresh milk, honey, and slices of ripe banana. The bowl was heavy, the milk sloshing dangerously close to the rim as they made their way down the muddy path to the river. The air by the water was colder, as if the river itself breathed out against the skin. The surface moved lazily, carrying bits of reed and the occasional drifting leaf. Rafiq scanned it for any sign of the stillness he had seen before, but for now, the water seemed ordinary. The elders stood in a half circle at the edge, the garlands draped over their arms, the baskets of rice at their feet. Bashir began to chant, low, rhythmic syllables in a dialect so old that even Rafiq couldn't catch the meaning. The others joined in, their voices blending into something deep and resonant, like the hum of the earth itself. One by one, the villagers stepped forward to place their offerings in the river. The garlands floated, bobbing gently before drifting away. The rice loosened into the current, dissolving into pale clouds. When it was Rafiq's turn, Amina touched his arm. "Don't look too long," she murmured. He nodded, but his heart was pounding. He stepped forward until his toes were almost in the water, knelt, and lowered the clay bowl into the current. The milk swirled out, white against the dark surface, the honey melting into golden ribbons. That's when he heard it. A faint sound beneath the chanting, beneath the rush of the river, like someone exhaling just under the water. He froze. And then, slowly, the milk stopped drifting. It began to spin, forming a small whirlpool that grew wider and darker at its center. Something pale moved within it. Before he could stop himself, Rafiq leaned closer. A face emerged beneath the swirl, pale, still, framed by strands of black hair that waved in the current without stirring the water above. The eyes were open, fixed on his, and the mouth moved. "Come down," it whispered, though no one else seemed to hear. A hand broke the surface, slender, white as bone, dripping with water that smelled faintly of rock. It reached toward the bowl and then toward him. "Rafiq!" Amina's voice snapped him back. She grabbed his shoulder and yanked him backward just as the hand vanished beneath the current. The whirlpool closed, leaving only the faint milky cloud drifting downstream. The chanting continued as if nothing had happened, but Rafiq knew. She had seen him again. It began the night after the offering. At first, it was just rain, heavy, steady, the kind that the villagers were used to. But by midnight, it had changed. The drops no longer felt like rain. They came harder, sharper, like handfuls of pebbles striking the roof. The wind drove them sideways, forcing the water in through cracks between the bamboo slats. By dawn, the rain had not eased for a single breath. The sky was an unbroken slab of black, the horizon erased entirely. From the veranda, Rafiq could see no land beyond the nearest row of houses. Everything between was water, not just the paths, but the yards, the gardens, even the tops of the fishing traps that usually stood well above the river's reach. The smell of the river was everywhere. It clung to the air, to his skin, to the damp cloth of his shirt. Amina had boiled neem leaves on the fire to keep the air inside the house clean, but even the bitter medicinal scent couldn't mask it. By midday, the water was lapping against the stilts of their home. Rafiq leaned over the veranda railing and peered down. The current was stronger here than it should have been, swirling in patterns that didn't match the wind. Once, he thought he saw something pale glide between the stilts, but when he leaned closer, it was gone. Inside, the puddle had grown into a shallow sheet covering most of the floor. The fire pit was the only dry space left, its clay base raised above the boards. Amina moved about barefoot, the water rippling around her ankles, but she never looked down. That night, Rafiq couldn't sleep. The drumming on the roof had become part of him, filling his skull until it felt like his own heartbeat. He sat on his mat, watching the water reflect the dim light of the dying fire. Then he heard it, the sound he feared most, breathing, slow, deliberate, too close. The surface shifted, just slightly, and then, as though the water itself decided to mirror the night sky, a pale oval emerged beneath it. Eyes opened, unblinking, locking on his. She was clearer than he had ever seen her. The strands of her hair floated outward, black against the water's surface, framing her face like a halo of darkness. Her lips curled into that same slow smile, the one that made his stomach turn cold. This time, she didn't whisper his name. She mouthed a different word. Soon. Rafiq stumbled backward, knocking over a clay pot. The sound startled Amina awake, and she rushed to him. But when she looked into the water, the face was gone. The rain kept falling, and Rafiq knew it would not stop until she took what she wanted. That night, the sound of the rain changed. It was no longer a constant roar on the roof. It came in waves, as if the clouds themselves were breathing. Between those waves, there was silence, deep, heavy, unnatural. The kind that makes your ears strain for something, anything. Rafiq lay on his mat, the air around him damp and heavy, the faint smell of the river filling his lungs. Sleep came in fragments, pulling him under and then releasing him without warning. At some point, he realized he was no longer in the house. He was standing barefoot on the riverbank. The sky above was a color he couldn't name. Not night, not dawn, but something in between. The water was perfectly still, smooth as polished stone, stretching out farther than he had ever seen it. There was no wind, no sound of birds, no sign of the village. Then he heard it. A single breath, slow, deliberate. From the center of the river, something moved toward him. It didn't disturb the water. It simply glided closer, as if the clouds themselves were breathing. Between those waves there was silence, deep, heavy, unnatural, the kind that makes your ears strain for something, anything. Rafiq lay on his mat, the air around him damp and heavy, the faint smell of the river filling his lungs. Sleep came in fragments, pulling him under and then releasing him without warning. At some point, he realized he was no longer in the house. He was standing barefoot on the riverbank. The sky above was a color he couldn't name. Not night, not dawn, but something in between. The water was perfectly still, smooth as polished stone, stretching out farther than he had ever seen it. There was no wind, no sound of birds, no sign of the village. Then he heard it. A single breath, slow, deliberate. From the center of the river, something moved toward him. It didn't disturb the water. It simply glided closer, as if the clouds themselves were breathing. Between those waves there was silence, deep, heavy, unnatural, the kind that makes your ears strain for something, anything. She rose from the surface like a shadow becoming solid. Water poured from her hair, streaming down over her shoulders, but her clothes clung dry to her body, as if the river had chosen not to touch them. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and fixed on him. "Rafiq," she said, and this time the voice was not in his chest, it was in the air, right in front of him. He wanted to run, but his feet were rooted in the wet sand. "Whisper," she said, stretching out a hand. Her skin was as white as bone, her fingers long and too thin, the nails dark like they had been buried in silt for years. The water behind her began to rise, curling upward like the spine of a wave, but it didn't crash. It reached, arching toward him like a living thing. In the next instant, the sand beneath his feet gave way. He was sinking, the cold wrapping around his legs, his waist, his chest. The water closed over his mouth before he could shout. It was not the chaotic pull of a drowning. It was deliberate. Something had him, pulling him down, deeper and deeper. The surface above grew smaller, darker. Around him the water was strangely clear, and in that clarity faces began to appear, pale, open-eyed, mouths frozen mid-breath. Hands reached from the darkness, brushing his arms, his neck, his hair. Each touch was icy, numbing, but the grip pulling him downward was warm, almost human. Through the press of bodies, her face appeared again, right in front of him. Her lips barely moved. "You're mine." His lungs burned. He tried to fight, but his arms moved as if through syrup. The darkness deepened, the faces closing in until there was no water, no air, no space. He woke with a violent gasp, choking on nothing, his body slick with sweat, and something else. When he looked down, his hands were wet, and he was lying in the middle of the floor. The water in the house pooled all around him. The morning after the dream, the rain finally eased, but the river didn't recede. It stayed high and dark, pressing against the village like an unblinking eye. Rafiq sat on the veranda, his hands still remembering the cold grip from the night before. No matter how many times he told himself it was just a dream, the dampness he'd woken to, the water pooled around his body, refused to be explained away. Amina was inside, sorting through an old wooden chest she kept beneath her bed. She almost never opened it. Rafiq could count on one hand the number of times he had seen her touch it. The chest was small, dark with age, its brass fittings dulled to a deep brown. When he stepped inside, she looked up quickly, her expression unreadable. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Looking for something," she said shortly, turning back to the chest. He sat on the floor beside her as she shifted through layers of folded cloth, old saris, neatly wrapped shawls, and a small stack of yellowing papers bound with twine. Underneath them, she lifted out a thin, rectangular object wrapped in a piece of cotton. She hesitated before unwrapping it. It was a photograph. The edges were frayed, the surface warped slightly from years of humidity, but the image was still clear enough, a group of women standing on the bank of the Padma, the water behind them calm and glinting in the sun. They wore saris in light colors, their hair long and loose. Most of them were smiling for the camera, but one face made Rafiq's breath catch. She wasn't smiling. Her head was tilted slightly down, her dark eyes fixed on something outside the frame. Her skin looked almost too pale compared to the others, and even in the faded black and white tones, there was a strange sharpness to her features, the kind that made her seem more alive than the rest. It was her, the water portrait. Rafiq's voice was barely a whisper. "Daddy, who is that?" Amina didn't answer right away. Her fingers gripped the edges of the photograph so tightly that the paper bent. Finally, she said, "My sister." He blinked. "Your sister?" "She was called Sharifa, the same Sharifa I told you about. She died before you were born, but she didn't leave." Rafiq stared at the image, the face that had haunted the river and the puddles in his home. "Why does she look exactly the same?" "Because she is exactly the same," Amina said, and there was no doubt in her tone. "The river took her, it kept her, and it gave her something back, something that isn't meant to walk among the living. That's what you've seen." The photograph seemed colder in his hands than the air around him. He realized that in the picture, the water behind Sharifa wasn't reflecting sunlight like it did for the others. It was perfectly still, a dark, mirror-like patch. Rafiq handed the photo back, but his fingers trembled. "Why me?" he asked. Amina's eyes softened, but only slightly. "Because blood calls to blood. She knows you, and now she wants you." Outside, a single drop of rain landed on the veranda, then another. By the time Amina put the photograph back into the chest, the steady hiss of the monsoon had returned. And somewhere beneath that sound, Rafiq thought he heard her voice again. Closer this time. That night, the rain was so loud it drowned out every other sound. The roof rattled under the assault, and the walls of woven bamboo swayed with each gust of wind. Inside, the air was thick with dampness, the fire sputtering as drops of water fell from the thatch above. Rafiq sat close to Amina, the wooden chest between them. He could still see the pale, unsmiling face from the photograph every time he closed his eyes. "Dadi," he said finally, his voice low but firm, "I want to know everything, not pieces, not warnings, the truth." Amina didn't look at him right away. Her hands were busy folding a shawl, smoothing its frayed edges as if the motion could buy her time. When she did meet his gaze, her eyes were dark and steady. "You think the river is just water, but it remembers. It holds what it is given, and it doesn't always give it back the same way." She leaned back slightly, her voice slipping into the rhythm of an old story, one told rarely and only when it could no longer be avoided. "Sharifa was my younger sister. She was different. She had a way of making people look at her, even when she wanted to be invisible. Men noticed her, and some women didn't forgive her for it. Our parents promised her to a man from the next village, rich, old, and cruel. She begged them not to, but in those days, a girl's begging meant nothing." Amina's hands paused on the shawl, smoothing its frayed edges as if the motion could buy her time. When she did meet his gaze, her eyes were dark and steady. The night before the wedding, she came to me. She said she'd rather be swallowed by the river than spend a single day as that man's wife. I thought she was speaking in anger. I didn't follow her when she left. The fire cracked sharply, making Rafik flinch. They found her scarf in the roots of the old fig tree, but not her body. And when the river keeps a body, it means the soul can't leave. It lingers, trapped between here and whatever waits beyond. Rafik swallowed. So she became this? She became what the river made of her. The longer a soul is trapped, the less human it becomes. It learns to want, to take, to replace, and when blood of its own blood walks too close to the water, it calls to them. Rafik finished, the truth settling cold in his stomach. Amina nodded slowly. She called to me once. The first monsoon after her death, I saw her face in the river. She smiled at me with my own mouth. I knew what she wanted. I stayed away from the water for years, but she's patient. She waits. Rafik's voice was barely a whisper. Why didn't she take you? Because I never let her in, Amina said, her eyes hardening. I never looked too long. I never answered when she spoke my name. But you, she exhaled, the sound heavy. You've already looked, and you've already listened. The rain hammered the roof harder, as if punctuating her words. Rafik wanted to speak, to ask what he could do, but before he could, a faint sound rose beneath the rain, a slow, deliberate inhale. It came from somewhere close, too close. Both of them turned toward the corner of the room. The water there was higher than it had been before, and its surface was perfectly still. Amina's voice dropped to a whisper. Don't move. The water quivered once, as if from a breath beneath it. Then just for an instant, the pale outline of a face broke the surface before vanishing again. She knows we're talking about her, and that makes her hungry. For the next 2 days, Rafik tried to follow every word of Amina's warnings. He avoided the puddles in the house, never let his eyes linger on the river, and shut his ears to anything that might sound like his name. But the harder he tried, the more it seemed Jolchhobi found ways to reach him. On the morning of the 3rd day, the rain broke for the first time in weeks. The sky turned a pale, washed-out blue, and the villagers emerged from their homes, stretching their backs and breathing in the heavy, humid air. It should have been a relief, but for Rafik, the stillness felt wrong, like the pause between a predator's breath and its strike. Amina sent him to fetch oil from the storeroom. The small wooden shed stood on stilts just behind the house, its single window covered with a scrap of tin. The air inside was thick with the smell of dried herbs, old rope, and kerosene. On the shelf above the oil jars, a small round metal mirror hung from a nail, a simple thing the family had used for decades. Rafik barely noticed it most days. Today, it noticed him. As he reached for the jar, a flicker caught his eye. Not movement exactly, but a shift in the light, as though the mirror had caught a glimmer from somewhere it shouldn't. He glanced at it. His own reflection stared back, but it wasn't his own. The face had his shape, his hair, even his clothes, but the skin was far too pale, the eyes too dark and wet, as though they belonged to something that had been underwater too long. And then, it smiled. It wasn't his smile. The corners of the mouth pulled too far, revealing teeth that seemed faintly gray, as if stained by silt. He froze, the jar of oil slipping slightly in his hands. The reflection's lips began to move. Though no sound reached his ears, he understood the shape of the words. Look longer. Rafiq staggered back, his shoulder striking the wall. The reflection leaned forward in the mirror, closing the space between them, even though he hadn't moved closer. The air in the storeroom grew damp and cold. A drop of water slid down the surface of the mirror, though it hadn't been touched. It traced a line down the pale face's cheek, not a tear, but a bead of river water. Another drop followed, and another. Within seconds, the entire mirror was slick, as though it had been dipped into the river. Behind the reflection, shapes began to form. Other faces, pale and still, their eyes open and fixed on him. One by one, they pressed closer to the glass, their mouths opening in silent gasps. Rafiq lunged forward and tore the mirror from the nail, turning it face down on the floor. The moment it hit the wood, a faint splash echoed in the small space, too loud for such a simple movement. His hands shook as he grabbed the oil and hurried back to the house. Amina took one look at his face and knew. "She's getting stronger," she said. "When she starts following you in things that aren't water, it means she's close to crossing over." Rafiq swallowed hard. "How long until she does?" Amina's eyes didn't leave his. "Not long enough." That night, he dreamed of mirrors, hundreds of them, and in each one, she was closer. The decision was made before sunrise. When the rooster crowed, its call was answered not by the usual clatter of morning chores, but by the deep, measured beat of a hand drum echoing through the mist. That sound was not for celebration. It was the drum of summons, used only when the village faced something it could not fight with nets or knives. By mid-morning, the Oturgor was full. The air smelled of damp wood, incense, and the faint bitterness of neem smoke. The elders sat in a half circle, their faces shadowed by the flickering oil lamps. "She will not wait for the next moon," Bashir said, his voice hoarse but unwavering. "The signs are too strong, the puddles in the houses, the faces in the glass, the deaths." Shahana nodded, her eyes on Rafiq. "And she has marked her choice. We cannot protect him by hiding. The only way to keep her from crossing over is to face her at the edge of the water, under the binding chant." Rafiq felt every gaze in the room settle on him. "You want me there?" he said low. Bashir did not deny it. "She will come only if she thinks you are ready to follow. The rest of us will hold the boundary." Amina's hand closed over his. She said, "It will be dangerous if the circle breaks before the chant ends." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. That evening, the preparations began. The villagers wove garlands of marigold and jasmine, their sharp scents meant to confuse wandering spirits. Clay bowls were filled with river water, mixed with crushed turmeric and chili powder, a blend the elders claimed could sting a ghost's eyes. By nightfall, the rain had stopped, leaving the air heavy and wet. The moon was just a thin curve of silver hanging low over the river. They led Rafiq to the bank. A circle of oil lamps had been placed in the mud, their flames steady despite the faint wind. The elders stood around him, each holding a brass bell and a strip of white cloth. The youngest of them, barely older than Rafiq, carried a small conch shell and a bundle of incense sticks already smoldering. Bashir stepped forward, his bare feet sinking into the wet earth. "When she comes," he told Rafiq, "you must not move toward her, no matter what she says. Keep your eyes on the ground. If she touches you, the circle will not hold." Rafiq nodded, though his mouth was dry. The chant began low, a hum that rose and fell like the river's own breathing. The bells rang in uneven patterns, their high notes clashing in a way that made the hair on his arms stand on end. The smoke from the incense curled into the night air, carrying with it the mingled scents of flowers, ash, and something darker, the smell of the river itself. Then the water changed. A patch near the center of the channel went still, the ripples fading until it became a black mirror. From its surface, a pale oval began to rise. She came slowly, her hair spreading in dark strands over the water, her eyes fixed on him. The voice that followed was soft, but carried across the air as if the night itself bore it to him. Rafiq. He kept his eyes on the ground. You've been waiting. So have I. Her voice was almost warm now, coaxing, like a friend urging him to join her just beyond the door. It's quiet here. No hunger, no pain, only the water holding you. Come. The bells rang louder. The chant rose in pitch, sharp and insistent. The smell of flowers thickened until it made him dizzy. Then her voice turned colder. Look at me. The water lapped at the bank, just inches from his toes. He could feel the chill of it seeping through the earth. She hissed, and her hand broke the surface, white, slender, dripping black water. It reached for the edge of the circle. One of the elders flung the turmeric water toward her. It splashed across her face, and for the first time she recoiled. Her mouth opened in a soundless scream, and the surface of the river erupted with ripples. Bashir shouted for the chant to continue, but Rafiq could feel the ground beneath him soften, as though the river was pulling it away. And then, just before the final verse of the chant, he heard her whisper again, not angry this time, but almost amused. Soon. The patch of still water shattered into waves, and she was gone. The bells fell silent. The night seemed to exhale, but Rafiq knew she hadn't been driven away. She had only been reminded of the way in. For 2 nights after the ritual, Rafiq did not see her. The river flowed restless under the thin moon. The puddles in the house shrank, and even the mirror in the storeroom showed only his own tired face. The villagers dared to hope the calling had been broken. Rafiq knew better. On the 3rd night, the rain returned. Not the heavy hammering of the monsoon's peak, but a slow, steady fall, each drop deliberate, as if counting time. Amina was asleep, her breathing shallow in the dark, when Rafiq woke to a sound that did not belong to the rain. It was the soft lap of water inside the house. He sat up slowly. The puddle had returned, but it was deeper now, reaching halfway across the room. The moonlight through the slats painted its surface silver, and in that silver, she was waiting. Her face was clearer than ever, no ripples, no distortion, just pale skin, eyes dark and endless, lips curved in the faintest smile. You've made them work hard for you, she said, her voice low and calm, as though they were speaking in the same room. The chanting, the fire, the flowers, they almost made me tired. Rafiq's throat tightened. What do you want from me? Her smile widened, just enough to show the edges of teeth. What I have always wanted. To walk where you walk, to breathe where I breathe, to live where I drowned. He shook his head. I won't follow you. You don't have to, if someone takes your place. The words hit him like cold water. My place? Every step into the living world must be paid for, a body for a body. The river will not let me leave without one to keep. He stared at her. You mean someone else has to die? That's not my choice, she said lightly. It's the way the river works. You could give me anyone, a stranger, an enemy, even someone you love. I would take them instead, and you would be free. Rafiq's stomach turned. You think I'd do that? Her smile faded into something colder. You will. When the water is at your throat and the breath is leaving your body, you will give me a name, and I will take it. The surface of the puddle darkened, the silver moonlight swallowed as if by a shadow beneath. Her face began to sink, her voice following him into the black. You have until the last rain, then you choose or I choose for you. The water rippled once, and she was gone. Rafiq sat in the dark, his body cold, the sound of her words heavier than the rain on the roof. He realized then that this was no longer just about resisting her. It was about surviving without becoming the kind of man who would feed her someone else's life. And the monsoon was far from over. The storm came without warning. By late afternoon, the wind had turned strange, moving in sharp, unpredictable gusts that rattled shutters and sent the scent of the river deep into every home. The sky was not the usual gray of the monsoon, but a deep, bruised green, as if something poisonous had seeped into the clouds. By nightfall, the rain fell in sheets so thick that the oil lamps flickered even inside the houses. The water rose fast, faster than anyone had seen in years. By midnight, it lapped at the floors of the stilted homes, carrying with it branches, broken baskets, and the occasional bloated carcass of an animal swept from higher ground. The villagers shouted over the roar of the storm, herding children onto higher platforms, tying livestock to whatever posts remained above the water. But every few minutes, someone would cry out, not in panic, but in grief, as another house was claimed by the current. From the veranda, Rafiq watched the river swallow the last strip of the path between the houses. There was no clear line now between river and village. The water was everywhere, restless and dark. And then he saw her. She was no longer a pale blur beneath the surface. She stood waist-deep in the middle of what had been the market square, her hair streaming out behind her in the current, her white skin almost glowing in the storm's darkness. Even from a distance, he could see her eyes fixed on him, unblinking. The wind shifted, and her voice carried across the water as if the storm itself had opened a path for it. It's time. Amina gripped his arm from behind. Don't move, she hissed, but her voice shook. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the water around Jolchhobi. It was not empty. Pale shapes drifted just beneath the surface, dozens of them, their faces turned upward, their hair floating like black weeds. All of them were watching. The current pressed against the stilts of their home, making the wood groan. Rafiq felt the vibration through his feet. You know the price, Jolchhobi said. The water around her rose to her chest, but she didn't sink. Give me a name, and you live. Say nothing, and you come with me. Her hand lifted, palm open. The water between them began to swirl, pulling debris, leaves, and pieces of broken wood into a slow spiral. Behind him, Amina's breathing was ragged. You can't, she whispered. If you give her one life, she'll never stop asking for more. Rafiq's throat tightened. The swirl of water was at the base of the veranda now, darkening as if the depth had no end. The wind screamed through the gaps in the bamboo walls. Somewhere in the distance, a house collapsed with a sharp crack, swallowed immediately by the water. Lightning flashed again, and Jolchhobi was suddenly closer, only a few arms' lengths away, her eyes locked on his, her lips forming the words she wanted most. Choose. The spiral touched the veranda's edge. The pull was strong enough now that the boards beneath his feet creaked. Rafik clenched his fists. He didn't speak. Her smile faded, and for the first time, her expression shifted not to anger, but to something colder, determination. Then, I choose for you. The water surged upward. The water hit him like a living thing. One moment he was standing on the veranda, gripping the bamboo railing until his knuckles burned. The next, a cold force wrapped around his legs and yanked him forward. He gasped as the current swallowed him to the waist. The shock of it stole his breath. Above the roar of the storm, he heard Amina's voice, a sharp cry that was ripped away by the wind. The spiral pulled harder. The boards under his feet splintered as the water rose to his chest. Jolchhobi was right there now, her face inches from his, her hair swirling in the current like black ink in milk. She said it, she murmured, her voice strangely calm amid the chaos. Give me a name and walk away. Her eyes were not pleading, they were certain. She already believed he would break. The current surged again, lifting him off the veranda entirely. His legs kicked in the water, but it wasn't the river's pull he felt. It was her hand around his wrist, cold, unyielding, and yet somehow warm at the center, like the heat of something still alive. In his mind, names flickered, faces, people he knew, people he didn't. The thought of choosing one made bile rise in his throat. You're running out of air, she said, and she can't save you. Her eyes flicked toward the dim shape of Amina still clinging to the house. But I can. The current spun them both toward the open water. The village was a blur of rooftops and broken bamboo, the storm boiling above. Then he saw it, a wooden fishing platform half submerged, wedged against the remains of a tree trunk. If he could break free, the current might throw him there. But her grip didn't loosen. Say it, she whispered again, her lips so close he could see the faint blue of veins beneath her pale skin. Give me a name and breathe. His lungs screamed, his vision blurred. He knew that if he hesitated another second, the blackness waiting at the edge of his sight would close in. He forced the words out, though they were not the ones she wanted. My name. Her eyes widened, just slightly, as he pulled her hand tighter to his chest. If the river must keep someone, take me. For the first time, her smile faltered. You'd trade yourself? Lightning split the sky. The water around them erupted in white spray. She stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Very well, she said softly. The current surged downward, a vertical pull that dragged him into a cold so deep it burned. Above, the storm was gone. Below, there was only silence and the shifting shapes of pale faces turning toward him. And then he saw her not as the Jolchhobi of the river, but as the girl in the photograph. Dry hair, dark eyes, sorry rippling in a breeze from decades past. She touched his cheek once, almost gently, before the darkness claimed him. When the rains finally stopped, they didn't fade gently. It was as if the sky had simply run out of water. One morning, the wind shifted, the clouds thinned, and by midday, the first shafts of sun pierced the damp, swollen air. The river, swollen and restless for weeks, began to sink back into its bed. It left behind a skin of silt on everything: houses, trees, the faces of the people who had survived. The smell of rot lingered, heavy and sweet, clinging to the skin no matter how much they washed. The village was unrecognizable. Entire homes had vanished, carried away in the black current. The fishing nets that once hung neatly along the banks were twisted and half buried in mud. The marketplace was nothing more than scattered debris. Amina walked slowly through what remained, her bare feet sinking into the soft, warm earth. Her eyes searched every corner, every piece of driftwood, every tangle of reeds. She wasn't looking for belongings. She was looking for Rafiq. No one had seen him since the night of the storm. The elders had found pieces of the veranda from their house snagged in the branches of a tree downstream. There were no footprints leading away from it, no scraps of clothing, no body. Some said the river had taken him far away, perhaps into the main channel and out to sea. Others whispered that it was better not to ask. The ones who knew the old stories simply avoided Amina's eyes and kept their voices low. Days passed. The water continued to retreat, leaving behind small pools in the depressions of the land. Children poked at them with sticks, chasing tiny fish trapped inside. But when Amina passed one of these pools, she stopped. It was larger than the rest, deep enough to reflect the sky, and in that reflection, for the briefest instant, she saw his face. Not the face of a drowned man, pale and bloated, but Rafiq as he had been, alive, eyes bright, lips just beginning to curve into a smile. Then the wind stirred, the surface rippled, and it was gone. Amina didn't tell anyone. She only turned away, her shawl pulled tighter around her shoulders, and walked back toward the ruins of her home. But that night, long after the village had gone to sleep, she woke to a sound she hadn't heard since the height of the monsoon. A slow, deliberate inhale, followed by the faintest exhale, and it was coming from inside the house. The dry season settled in quickly after the flood. The river's edge pulled back farther each week, exposing wide stretches of cracked mud where children now played barefoot, their laughter a fragile sign that life was trying to return. But not everything the river left behind was harmless. In the home of Farid, the village's blacksmith, his youngest daughter, Layla, had been spending her afternoons playing in the storeroom while her mother worked. The storeroom was dark, its air still smelling faintly of wet rope and ash from the forge. Against one wall hung a tall, warped mirror, an heirloom passed down from Farid's mother, its surface speckled with age. One late afternoon, while tracing shapes in the dust on the floor, Layla glanced up at the mirror. At first, she saw herself, a thin girl with tangled hair, her cheeks still round with childhood. But then, as she tilted her head, the reflection didn't follow. Her real body stayed still, yet in the mirror, she was smiling. Except it wasn't her smile. The lips were older, the curve sharper, almost knowing, and the eyes, they were dark, steady, and far too deep for a child's. "Hello, Layla," the reflection said. Layla froze, her small hands curling into fists. "You're not me." The figure in the glass chuckled softly. "No, but I know you." She took a step back. "Who are you?" The man in the mirror, for it was a man now, though his features were faint under the glass, leaned closer. His hair was dark and wet, plastered against his forehead. His skin was pale as the belly of a dead fish. "My name is Rafiq." The name meant little to Layla, but she felt something cold settle in her chest. "What do you want?" Rafiq's smile didn't change. "To look, to remember, to wait." Behind him, in the blurred depth of the mirror, other faces began to appear, pale, silent, drifting like they were underwater. One of them moved closer to his shoulder, a woman with long black hair that floated around her like ink in a glass. Layla didn't know her name, but she knew somehow that this was the one to be afraid of. The woman's lips moved, forming words that didn't reach Layla's ears, but Rafiq nodded as if in answer. Then his eyes returned to the child. "Tell your grandmother that the river never forgets." Before Layla could scream, the mirror clouded over as if filled with smoke. When it cleared, it showed only her own frightened reflection. That evening, she told her father what she had seen. Farid laughed it off as a dream. But when Layla whispered the name Rafiq to her grandmother, her old woman's face went pale and her hands began to shake. The next day, the mirror was gone from the storeroom. No one said where it went. But that night, in the black water pooled behind the blacksmith's house, two faces floated side by side, one of a woman, one of a man, and both were smiling. The year passed slowly, but the fear in the village never truly left. Even in the dry months, when the sun burned the mudflats into cracked mosaics and the river shrank to a thin silver ribbon, people avoided looking into any still water. But no one could avoid the rain forever. The first monsoon storm came at dusk, rolling in with a wall of dark clouds that blotted out the horizon. The air grew heavy, and the wind carried with it the smell of the river, deep, metallic, and cold, as though it were already inside the village. By nightfall, the rain was falling in thick, slanting sheets. The paths turned to rivulets, the yards to shallow ponds, and in the low places between the houses, the water began to collect. Farid's daughter Layla sat by the doorway, watching the rain streak down the bamboo walls. Her grandmother had warned her not to look into the panos, but curiosity had a way of eroding fear. When she thought no one was watching, she leaned closer to the largest one forming just beyond the threshold. At first, it was only her own reflection in the dim light. Then the surface darkened, the rain seeming to slide over it without breaking the smoothness. A face appeared beneath. It was the man from the mirror, Rafiq, his eyes steady, his lips curling into a slow smile. "Layla," he said softly, though the rain roared around them. She backed away, but another shape began to rise beside him, the woman with the long black hair, her face pale and perfect, her eyes fixed not on Layla, but on something beyond, as if she were already seeing the girl's place in her world. The woman's lips moved, and though Layla couldn't hear the words, Rafiq answered them aloud. "Yes, she will do." The puddle trembled as if something beneath had touched its surface. A thin ripple spread outward, but the faces remained, unbroken by the movement. "Next rain," Rafiq said, his voice a promise and a threat. "When the water is high enough, we'll come for you." Then both faces sank, the surface breaking into ordinary ripples under the downpour. Layla stumbled back, her breath quick and shallow. She wanted to run to her grandmother to tell her what she had seen, but when she looked at the doorway, her grandmother was already standing there. The old woman's face was pale, her eyes fixed on the puddle. She didn't need to be told. "It's starting again," she whispered. And outside, the rain showed no sign of stopping. The rain never stopped that week. It came in waves, sometimes pounding the roof so hard that the air shook, sometimes falling in a steady whisper that made it impossible to tell if it was inside or outside. The village sank deeper each day, the river reclaiming ground as though it had simply been waiting for permission. By the fourth night, Leela had stopped sleeping. She kept hearing it, the sound of breathing, slow and steady just outside her window. Whenever she looked, she saw nothing but the curtain of rain. Her grandmother moved her mat closer to the fire, away from the door, but even then, Leela could feel the pull of the water. It was in the corners of the house now, seeping through the floorboards in thin, patient lines. On the fifth night, the puddle near the doorway grew large enough to reflect the entire room. At first, it was empty. Then two faces rose from the dark, Rafiq and the woman. They didn't speak, they only watched. Leela's grandmother stood in front of her, shielding her with her body. But the woman's gaze never shifted. It slid over the older woman as though she weren't there, fixing on Leela with a quiet certainty. The rain deepened into a roar. The puddle trembled once, then stilled again, its surface becoming so clear that it seemed less like water and more like a hole into another place. Rafiq's lips moved. This time, the words were for the grandmother. "You could trade for her," he said softly. "Give us another, and she stays." The old woman didn't answer. The woman with the black hair leaned closer to the surface, so close that a single drop slid from her hair into the puddle, sending out a perfect ripple. Her voice came like a breath in the ear. "It's not about who we take. It's about the taking. The river is never full." The grandmother pulled Leela back toward the far wall, but as they moved, the puddle stretched, its edges creeping across the floorboards faster than the rain could feed it. It reached for them like a shadow. Then lightning flashed, and for a split second, the reflection changed. It wasn't Leela's house anymore. It was another room, far away, with another face staring down into the water. Your face. The eyes in the reflection widened, as if they recognized you. And somewhere, faint but clear, a voice you knew you shouldn't answer whispered your name. The surface rippled once, then the faces were gone. The puddle was just water again, but the sound of slow, deliberate breathing was still there, now not just outside the window, not just in the corner of the room, but behind you. Because no one escapes.